There's a small wooden hatch on the side of a Florida farmhouse about 2 feet off the ground that opens not into a room, but into the space underneath the house. Open the hatch. What you see is dirt, packed earth, a few flat rocks, a piece of an old plow blade rusted in place, and standing on the dirt, looking back at you with the expression chickens have when they're interrupted, is a chicken. Behind the chicken are 6 more chickens. To the chicken's left is a hound dog lying flat on its side. To the dog's left, in the cool shadow of a stone pier, is something coiled that is not a hose. Welcome to the basement of a Florida cracker house. The Florida cracker house, built in the rural settlements of Central and North Florida between the 1820s and the early 1900s, was raised between 2 and 3 feet above the ground on stone piers, wooden posts, or piles of oyster shell bound with lime and water. The space under the floor was open on all 4 sides. Anything that could fit through a 2-foot gap could live there. The family that lived in the house above understood this completely. They had built it this way on purpose. In a state where the temperature in August touches 100 degrees, where the humidity hits 95% before 9 in the morning, and where the soil holds standing water for weeks after every summer storm, the open space under the house was the reason the family could live in the house at all. The chickens, the hound, the snake, and the dirt were not a problem. They were part of the building. This is the story of a piece of vernacular American architecture that was invented out of pure necessity by a few generations of poor farmers and cattle ranchers in 19th century Florida that produced houses cool enough to be livable in a swamp before air conditioning existed, and that has since been rebranded, repackaged, and resold as a lifestyle product by people who would not, on any actual August afternoon in Central Florida, want to live in the original. The first thing to understand about a Florida cracker house is that it does not touch the ground. Stand on a dirt road in front of one of these houses on a summer morning, sometime around 8 in the morning before the heat has built. What you see is a low rectangle of unpainted pine boards, maybe 30 feet wide, with a porch running the full length of the front. The walls are wood, the roof is metal, angled steeply, the corrugated panels reflecting the morning sun. There is a centered front door. There are 2 windows on each side of the door. There is, between you and the front porch, a set of 3 wooden steps, because the porch is approximately 30 inches above the ground. Walk closer and crouch and look under the porch, and you can see straight through to the backyard, through the open gap that runs the entire length of the house. The whole building is floating. The corners of the porch and the corners of the house itself rest on piers, stone, brick, wood, sometimes a poured mixture of lime and crushed oyster shell called tabby that the people of coastal Florida had been making for 200 years. The piers are between 2 and 3 feet high. Between the piers, on 3 sides, there is air. On the 4th side, the back, there might be a low lattice or a closed-off wall for storage. Mostly, there is air. This is the most distinctive single feature of the Florida cracker house, and it is doing 4 jobs at once. First, drainage. Florida is flat, waterlogged, and prone to standing pools of rainwater that take days to drain. A house sitting on the dirt sits in those pools. A house lifted 3 feet above the dirt does not. Second, ventilation. Hot air rises. Cool air sinks. The space under a Florida cracker house functions, on any given afternoon, as a heat reservoir of slightly cooler air that bleeds upward through gaps in the floorboards into the rooms above. A house sitting flat on the dirt cannot do this. A house on piers can. Third, pest control. The Florida ground was full of termites, ants, fleas, ticks, scorpions, rats, and snakes. Setting the wooden structure of the house up off the dirt put a physical gap between the wood and the things that would eat or live in it. The crawl space was patrolled in most working farmsteads by the family's chickens and at least 1 hound dog, both of which ate the smaller pests and discouraged the larger ones. Fourth, hurricanes. Florida is in the Atlantic hurricane belt. A house with a low profile sitting on piers with no continuous foundation to crack and no large air-catching face to push against performs surprisingly well in high winds. The water comes up underneath the house, not into it. The wind passes over the steep metal roof, not against a flat wall. The Florida cracker farmer who built one of these houses in 1860 did not write down the 4 functions of his raised floor. He didn't have to. He built it the way his neighbors built theirs, the way his father built his back in Upland, Georgia, the way the cracker building tradition had been refining itself generation by generation for 50 years before he turned up on the property line. The knowledge of how to make a Florida house survive a Florida summer was stored in the buildings themselves. Each new family that built a cracker house learned by looking at the houses already standing nearby. There are people writing in academic journals today at the Florida Solar Energy Center about how to replicate this exact system in 21st century zero-energy housing. They're doing complicated calculations involving thermal mass and airflow modeling. The Florida cracker farmer arrived at the same answer with no calculations at all. The second thing to understand about a Florida cracker house is the roof. Stand inside the house during a summer thunderstorm. The temperature outside has dropped 15 degrees in the 10 minutes since the cloud bank moved in. The sky is the color of slate. The first heavy drops hit the roof. The sound of rain on a corrugated metal roof, angled at 45 degrees, inside a small wooden house, is not the sound of rain. It is a low drum, sustained, vibrating through the heart pine walls and the floor and the porch boards. The drum runs for as long as the storm runs, which in central Florida in July can be 90 minutes, sometimes 2 hours. Inside the drum, the house is dry. The water sheds off the metal roof in a single sheet, hits the dirt of the yard, and runs away into the slope. The walls of the house do not get wet. The floors do not get wet. The family does not get wet. The metal roof on a Florida cracker house was, in the earliest examples, made of wood shingle. By the late 1800s, as corrugated steel and factory-made nails became available through general stores in Florida's small towns, the metal roof became standard. The pitch, close to 45 degrees, sometimes steeper, was preserved across the transition. The steep pitch sheds water in a single rush rather than letting it pool. The metal surface reflects sunlight rather than absorbing it. The combination keeps the house dry in the wettest hours of the year and cool in the hottest hours. The drum, the sound the metal roof makes during a storm, is the central sensory memory of growing up in a Florida cracker house. Anyone over the age of 70 who was raised in Central Florida can describe it from memory. The drum is also the reason the older Floridians who grew up under it have an emotional reaction to the sound of rain on a modern asphalt shingle roof. It is a wrong sound. It is a flat thump where there should be a sustained drum. Asphalt shingle on rafters insulates. Metal on roof beams resonates. The two materials make different rain. In the small town of Cross Creek, in north-central Florida, there is a house with a metal roof that has been standing since the 1880s. A writer lived in that house for 13 years. She wrote a book on its porch that won the Pulitzer Prize. We'll arrive at her and the porch she wrote on by the end of the video, but first, the rest of the house she lived in. The third thing to understand about a Florida cracker house, and this may be the most important one, the one that makes the whole system work, is the porch. In a Florida cracker house, the porch is bigger than any room inside. Stand back from the house in the dirt yard. The building reads as a long, single-story rectangle. The outer layer is the porch, 8 feet deep, running the full width of the house in front, the full width again in back, sometimes wrapping the corners and running along the sides. The porch has its own roof, an extension of the main roof of the house. The porch has its own floor, the same plank-on-pier construction as the rooms inside. The porch has columns, plain wooden posts holding up the roof. The porch has a railing, The porch has, in most working cracker households, anywhere from 3 to 7 chairs on it. Some are straight-backed, some are rocking chairs. There is a porch swing on one end. There is, by the front door, a small table with a tin water cup on it. Inside the porch is the wall, made of heart pine boards, with 2 windows on each side of the centered door. Inside the wall is the actual interior: a hall, a parlor, a kitchen, a bedroom. The interior takes up maybe 60% of what the porch and the interior combined occupy on the lot. In other words, the people who built this house spent more lumber, more nails, more days of labor on the porch than on any single room inside. This was not decoration. This was where the family lived. The interior was where they slept and where they ate the formal meal. The porch was where they shelled the peas, mended the harness, snapped the green beans for canning, talked to the neighbor walking by on the road, watched the children play in the dirt yard, drank coffee at dawn, drank water at noon, drank whiskey at dusk, and on the hottest nights of August when the rooms inside the house held the day's heat past midnight, slept. The porch served as a passive cooling system for the house. The deep eave of the porch roof shaded the front wall of the house all afternoon. The breeze that ran along the porch carried the day's heat away from the wall. The wall stayed cooler. The room behind the wall stayed cooler. A Florida cracker house with a deep porch all the way around it was, at 4 in the afternoon in August, 8 to 10 degrees cooler inside than the same house without the porch would have been. The porch was the climate machine. The chairs on it were where the family operated the machine. A typical Florida cracker household in 1880 consisted of 2 adults, between 4 and 7 children, and depending on the season, anywhere from 1 to 3 additional people: a grandparent, a sibling staying for a visit, a hired hand brought on for the cattle drive. Somewhere on that porch, at almost every hour of daylight, somebody was working, shelling, mending, plucking, slicing, salting, watching, listening. The porch was not a place of rest. The porch was a workshop with a roof. The image of the family on the porch, relaxed in the rocking chairs, dressed in clean linen, watching the sunset, is real, but it is the image of half an hour at the end of the day. The other 12 hours of porch time were the working hours, and the people doing the work were not, in the postcard, in the photograph. A Florida cracker house was a low-cost shelter that depended, every single day, on enormous amounts of human labor to remain livable. The day begins before sunrise. The wife, and in a Florida cracker household it was almost always the wife, with help from the older daughters, is the first up. She is rebuilding the fire in the cook stove, which is in a separate small building behind the main house, connected by a covered walkway. The kitchen is detached because cooking with wood in a Florida summer inside the main house would make the main house uninhabitable by 10 in the morning. Putting the kitchen 10 yards away kept the heat outside the family living space. She is heating water on the stove. The water came from a well 40 yards from the kitchen, hand-pumped that morning into a bucket and carried back. There's no indoor plumbing. There will be no indoor plumbing in this house for another 50 years. She is mixing cornmeal for the morning's breakfast. She is feeding the chickens, the ones that did not spend the night under the house but instead in the small coop behind the kitchen. She is checking the smokehouse where last winter's pork is curing in salt and wood smoke. She has been moving for an hour and a half before the husband and the children are awake. The husband, when he gets up, is going out to the fields or the cattle pasture. The older boys go with him. The smaller boys stay near the house with their mother. The wife's day, in cracker terms, is the operation of the porch. She sweeps the porch every morning because dust and dirt blow in from the yard, and a clean porch is a sign of a respectable household. She sweeps the floor inside, which collects dust through the gaps between the floorboards. She washes laundry once a week in a tin tub on the porch with water heated on the cook stove. She hangs the laundry on a line strung between 2 trees in the yard. She's making meals 3 times a day in the detached kitchen, walking back and forth on the covered walkway with the food. She's canning, in season, anything the garden produces. She's making soap from animal fat and lye. She's mending clothes, on the porch, in the chair with the best afternoon light. She's teaching the children to read. She is, when the husband is away, the entire workforce of the household. The architecture of the house was designed structurally to make her work possible to do in the climate. The detached kitchen kept the heat out. The porch kept her out of the sun. The raised floor kept the snakes out of the bedroom. The metal roof kept the rain off the laundry. The cross-ventilation through the dog trot kept her body temperature down enough that she did not collapse. She did not collapse. She did the work. She did it for the 40 or 50 years she lived in the house. When she died, her daughter, if her daughter had married into another cracker household nearby, was doing the same work in a similar house a few miles away. The architecture is what is preserved in museums. The labor is what is missing from the photograph. The word cracker is a complicated one. Modern Florida in 2026 has not settled on a single meaning for it. The term originated, by the best historical understanding, in the 18th century. One theory traces it to the sound of the long whips that cattle drivers in Spanish Florida and frontier Georgia used to drive longhorn cattle through the palmetto scrub. The whips made a sharp crack. The men who used them became known, eventually, as crackers. Another theory traces it to the word cracker, meaning a poor white frontier settler, used as a term of contempt by wealthier Southerners. A third theory ties it to Scots-Irish dialect words for boastful talkers, to crack meaning to brag. What is settled is this. By the early 1800s, Florida cracker referred to a specific population of rural white settlers in North and Central Florida, mostly of Scots-Irish, Welsh, and English upland ancestry, who had migrated south from Georgia and the Carolinas in the decades after the United States acquired Florida from Spain in 1821. They were small farmers, cattle ranchers, hog raisers, and frontiersmen. They were not wealthy. They were not plantation owners. They were the working majority of 19th century rural Florida. The houses they built, small, wood frame, raised on piers, with deep porches and metal roofs and dog trot breezeways, became known over time as Florida cracker houses. The architectural type was named for the people who lived in it. The word cracker is, today, used by some descendants of these families with pride. It is used by others with caution. It is used in academic writing with quotation marks. It is used in real estate marketing without them as a brand. Old Florida cracker home for sale. Charming cracker cabin. Cracker chic estate, 4 acres. The word is doing different jobs depending on who is using it. What it points to, in any case, is the architecture. The Florida cracker house was, and is, the most successful piece of vernacular climate architecture the American South ever produced. It was the answer that a few generations of poor white settlers in 19th century Florida worked out to the problem of how to live in a swamp. It is the answer modern climate energy researchers are looking at again in the 21st century as the state confronts the limits of mechanical air conditioning and the cost of electricity in a hotter Florida. The Florida cracker farmer of 1860 had already done the engineering. In the small town of Cross Creek in north-central Florida, 21 miles southeast of Gainesville, there is a wood frame farmhouse that has been standing since approximately the 1880s. The house is small, 1 story. Heart pine boards, unpainted in the original construction, a metal roof angled steeply enough to shed central Florida rain, a wraparound porch running along the front and one side. The house is raised about 2.5 feet above the ground on stone piers. Underneath the house, in the open gap, on any given afternoon in 1930, there are several chickens, a hound dog named Pat, and on cool mornings, sometimes a black snake whose presence the family tolerates because the black snake eats the rattlesnakes. In 1928, a writer named Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings bought this house and 72 acres of orange grove for $2,700. She had moved to Florida from upstate New York because her marriage was failing and she needed a place to write. The house she bought was the cheapest property in the village. It had no electricity. It had no running water. The well was 40 yards behind the kitchen, which was a separate small building attached to the main house by a covered walkway. The bathroom was an outhouse, 60 yards into the orange grove. The walls had no insulation. The windows had wooden shutters but no glass in some of the openings. The porch ran the length of the front of the house and looked out across the dirt road into a stand of live oaks hung with Spanish moss. Rawlings moved in. She lived in the house for the next 13 years. She learned to operate the cook stove. She learned to draw water from the well. She learned to identify the snakes by their markings and to leave the black ones alone. She learned to recognize by their footsteps on the porch boards which of her neighbors was coming up the path. She learned the rhythms of the porch in summer and the rhythms of the porch in winter. She wrote, in those 13 years, on the porch. She wrote a novel called The Yearling on that porch. It was published in 1938. It won the Pulitzer Prize for the novel in 1939. It became, in the years that followed, one of the most widely read American novels of the 20th century, taught in schools across the country, made into a film with Gregory Peck. She wrote after that a memoir called Cross Creek about her 13 years in the house at Cross Creek. The book is, in part, a detailed description of the Florida cracker way of life. It is what most Americans who have read about cracker culture at all have read. Rawlings wrote in Cross Creek about the moment she understood she could not write the book she was supposed to be writing, a novel set in upstate New York, which her publisher had been waiting for because she had moved into a Florida cracker farmhouse and the Florida cracker farmhouse had taken her over. She wrote on the porch every morning with the hound dog Pat asleep against her foot and the chickens scratching in the yard. And what she wrote was about the people in Cross Creek and the woods around it, and the way the orange grove smelled in November, and the way the kitchen heated up in July. She had become, in the deepest practical sense, a cracker. She had not been one when she moved in, she was one when she walked out. The house is now a Florida state park. Visitors walk through it. The porch is restored, the kitchen is preserved. Rawlings's writing desk in the corner of the porch is still there. The well is still there. The orange grove behind the house is still there. The dirt road in front is still dirt. A visitor can sit in Rawlings' chair on the porch on a hot August morning in 2026 and feel the same breeze move through the same hall that ran through it for the 83 years before Rawlings was born and the 98 years since she bought the property. The architecture is the same architecture, the breeze is the same breeze. The Florida cracker house in its best surviving form is doing the same job today that it did in 1880. The job has not changed, the world around the job has. By the 1950s, the Florida cracker house was being torn down across the state. The reason was not that the houses had stopped working. The houses were working as well as they had ever worked. The porches were still cooling the walls. The raised floors were still drying out the ground underneath. The metal roofs were still shedding the rain. The chickens were still patrolling the crawl space. The architecture was unchanged. What had changed was the air conditioner. The first window unit air conditioners reached the Florida residential market in the late 1940s. By the 1950s, they were affordable to working-class families. By the 1960s, central air conditioning built into new construction at the foundation stage was standard on every new house in any Florida subdivision. The mechanical cooling of a single house in a Florida summer no longer required deep porches and high ceilings and dog-trot breezeways and raised floors. It required electricity and a working compressor. The Florida cracker house as a system became obsolete in roughly 20 years. Not because the system was wrong, because the alternative was easier. A family living in a cracker house in 1950 understood the deal completely. The porch worked, but it required someone to sweep it. The detached kitchen worked, but it required someone to carry the food. The raised floor worked, but it required someone to manage the chickens. The breezeway worked, but it was open to the rain. A family living in a brand new concrete block ranch house in a Florida subdivision in 1960 understood the deal too. The thermostat worked. It did not require anyone to sweep anything. It did not require a detached kitchen. It did not require chickens. The thermostat was for a family that had spent 4 generations operating a cracker house, a kind of miracle. The cracker houses were left behind. The families moved out. The houses in many cases were not sold or transferred. They were simply abandoned, allowed to weather, taken back by the palmetto scrub. Some collapsed, some were torn down for new construction. Some were stripped of their heart pine boards, which had become valuable as reclaimed lumber, and shipped to home stores in Atlanta and Charlotte. Some were photographed by the Florida State Archives in the 1930s and the 1940s, briefly documented as a vanishing form, and then forgotten. The Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings house at Cross Creek survived because of who had lived in it. Most cracker houses did not have a Pulitzer Prize winner attached to them. Most of them disappeared. In 1985, an architect named Ronald W. Haas, teaching at the University of Florida, published a book called Classic Cracker: Florida's Wood Frame Vernacular Architecture. The book documented for the first time in any systematic way the surviving Florida cracker houses across the state. Haas had spent years driving back roads, photographing farmhouses, measuring porches, sketching dog trot plans. The book was, in academic architectural history terms, a small triumph. It won the Lopresti Award for Excellence in Art Publishing in 1993. The book also did something Haas did not entirely intend. It introduced the Florida cracker house as an architectural form to people who had never heard of it. Architects, builders, developers, real estate marketers. By the 1990s, in the wealthier corners of Florida, Sarasota, Naples, certain neighborhoods of Tallahassee, certain coastal stretches near St. Augustine, a new building was appearing. It looked from the road like a Florida cracker house. Wood frame, raised floor, metal roof, wraparound porch, tabby pier construction. The new building was 4,000 square feet. It had granite countertops. It had central air conditioning. It had a swimming pool in the backyard. It had no chickens under the floor. The marketers called it cracker chic. The new buildings were, architecturally, a kind of homage to the Florida cracker house. They borrowed the silhouette, they borrowed the porch, they borrowed the metal roof and the heart pine boards and the raised pier foundation. They did not borrow the climate logic because the climate logic was no longer necessary. Central air conditioning had solved it. They did not borrow the labor structure because the family living in the cracker chic house was not going to sweep the porch every morning or carry food in from a detached kitchen. They were not going to operate the building. They were going to live in it. The cracker chic house was the silhouette of the working architecture without the work. It was the photograph without the labor that produced the photograph. In the same years that the cracker chic developments were going up in Sarasota and Naples, the actual surviving Florida cracker houses in the rural villages where they had been built, the houses that still had chickens under the floor and a working detached kitchen and a porch that someone swept every morning, were continuing to disappear. The descendants of the original cracker families were aging out of them, moving to assisted living, dying. The houses, often left without heirs willing to take them, were sold to developers who tore them down to build something larger on the same lot. The marketing language did not mention this. The marketing language said, authentic old Florida charm. It did not say we are building copies of the house we are tearing down for people who would not live in the original. A few houses survived. Rawlings's, a handful at historic state parks and folk architecture museums, some in the Cross Creek area where preservation rules slowed the demolition. The Lanier House, the Boyer House. Houses scattered across cracker villages in north-central Florida where the local historical societies fought hard enough to hold on. The rest are gone. The chickens that used to live under the floors of the rest of them are gone too. The crawl spaces that used to ventilate them are paved over. The porches that used to cool them are now screened-in lanais behind sliding glass doors. The system has been replaced by a thermostat. Drive to Cross Creek today, in 2026, and walk up to the Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings house. The dirt road is still dirt. The orange grove is smaller than it was, but it is still there. The Spanish moss is still hung in the live oaks across the road. Step up onto the porch. The boards are the same boards. They are pine. They have been refinished, but the wood is the wood Rawlings's foot stepped on in 1930 when she walked out onto this porch with a typewriter on her hip and a cup of coffee in her hand and sat down in the chair in the corner and started writing The Yearling. The breeze that runs across the porch on an August morning in 2026 is the same breeze that ran across this porch in 1930. The convection that pulled it through the dog trot in 1880 is doing the same job today. The architecture is the same architecture. Inside the house, the original kitchen, detached, attached to the main house by the covered walkway, is preserved. The cook stove is in it. The well, 40 yards behind the kitchen, is still in its place. The crawl space under the house is still open on 3 sides. There are no chickens in it any longer. The state park rules do not allow chickens. There used to be. The piers are still piers. The hatch on the side of the house, the small wooden hatch about 2 feet off the ground, is still there. Open it and what you see is dirt, packed earth, a few flat rocks. The shadow of the floor joists overhead. In the empty space under the floor of Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings' house on an August afternoon in 2026, the only thing missing from the picture is the chicken. The Florida Cracker House is, on the state's preservation registry, a tract architectural form. 18 examples are protected as state landmarks or located within state parks. Several hundred more, by the Florida Solar Energy Center's estimates, survive in private ownership across the state. The total has been declining at roughly 2% a year for the past 40 years. What is left, beyond the houses themselves, is the system. The system is what the Florida Solar Energy Center is studying when it sponsors cracker-style design competitions for energy-efficient housing. The system is what the architects building new houses in the climate-conscious corner of Florida construction are referencing when they specify deep porches and metal roofs and raised foundations. The system is what the Cross Creek State Park is preserving when it keeps the Rawlings house open to visitors. The system is the answer to a problem the state of Florida is, in 2026, beginning to repose. As the climate warms, as the electricity grid strains in the summer afternoons of every July and August, as the cost of running central air conditioning rises year over year, as the hurricane season lengthens and intensifies, the state is asking the same question the Florida cracker farmer in 1860 answered. How does a person live in this climate on minimum resources without dying of heat stroke in August? The cracker answer was, lift the house off the ground, put the kitchen outside, build a porch that wraps the whole structure, pitch the roof steep, cover the roof in metal, cut a hole through the middle to let the breeze run, plant trees that shade the porch, sweep the porch every day. Keep chickens under the floor. The new Florida house, the one being built in the climate-conscious corner of the state, is most of that answer minus the sweeping and the chickens. It is the architecture without the labor. The Florida cracker farmer in 1860 did not have that option. The labor was the architecture. The architecture was the labor. The chickens were not optional. The sweeping was not optional. The porch was the workshop and the climate machine and the family living room at the same time. What the modern house borrows is the climate machine. What it leaves behind is the workshop and the living room, and mostly the chicken. The hatch on the side of the Rawlings house in Cross Creek is closed in the afternoon by the state park staff. The boards inside are unchanged from 1930. The dirt is the same dirt. The piers are the same piers. The breeze that runs through the open gap underneath the house is the same breeze that ran through it in 1880. Sit in Rawlings's chair on the porch late on an August afternoon and look out across the dirt road into the live oaks. The light is gold and low. The breeze is moving the Spanish moss. Somewhere in the orange grove, a chicken is making a sound. The chicken is not from this farm. It is wandering loose from the next farm over. It will wander home eventually. The Florida Cracker House is still here. Most of the houses are not. The breeze is the breeze. The chickens are mostly gone.